In a departure for Murder of Crows, this episode will focus on a discussion that I had with noted criminologist and all-round good egg, Dr. Honor Doro Townshend. And this discussion was regarding the Stephenport murders. I covered these appalling crimes in episode 78. And if you are in any way unfamiliar with the case, I would recommend watching that episode before watching the discussion about the case. But with all of that said, this is my chat with Honor Doro Townshend, and this is Murder of Crows. In terms of the Stephenport case, do you think that he intended to kill from the outset, or do you think that's something he just kind of happened upon because of his methods?
That's an interesting question. It's something I've considered quite a lot because I've covered this case on two separate shows now. So I'm quite familiar with a lot of the details, and quite in depth as well on. We did a show called Murder at First Swipe for Amazon Prime, where it was a long look at this case specifically. And I think there's arguments for both. My personal thought, having read everything I've read about this case, is that in terms of his first victim, Anthony, I think it's entirely possible that it was a case of negligence. However, his actions thereafter, I think, are very different. Now, Port himself claims that these are all accidental. Even to this day, he still claims that, despite being convicted. However, I think whilst there might be an argument for that first case that it wasn't intentional, the fact that he then went through such efforts to hide the evidence, not be attached to the case, even as far away to go, he was sentenced to a short prison stint for perverting the course of justice. And I think that suggests that whilst it might not have been his outset intention, he also didn't care regardless, right?
Yeah.
It's like his sexual gratification was more important
Yes.
than any of those young men's lives. That's certainly how I see it. And I think after the
Yeah.
first case with Anthony, because he, at that point, there's no questioning. He knows what the outcomes are going to be, right? Because this
Yeah.
has already happened. And the fact that he then keeps on repeating this same
Yeah.
modus operandi, despite knowing the potential risks,
Yes.
evidenced by Anthony's
Yes.
passing, that suggests to me that from that point on, it became, whether it was intentional to begin with or not, it's
Yes.
intentional thereafter.
I mean, in terms of Anthony, as you say, it could have been accidental initially, but do you think his calling an ambulance was a genuine compassion, or was it just him trying to move blame elsewhere?
Yeah, I personally think the latter. I think so. He calls the ambulance and says that he's found this young man, but it's not done from a place of either panic or compassion, because this is someone who's already moved the body.
Mm,
Um, and he doesn't stick around to ensure that,
mm,
Anthony is picked up or anything like that. Um, I personally see that as his intention is to shift potential suspect from himself, even
mm.
though that might sound counterintuitive because he's calling. He
Yeah.
doesn't provide a lot of details. He
No,
doesn't stick
no.
around. They only find out that it's linked to him properly because they trace the phone number back, I believe,
Yes, that's right.
and they managed to get into his apartment because his flatmate at the time comes home
Mm,
and he lets him in. And at that point, Port is already asleep in bed. And I just say, even if this was just a pure accident, awful circumstances, an act that
mm,
was supposed to be consensual involving chemsex and it's gone terribly wrong, the fact that Port was then able to go and get back into bed and
mm.
sleep, I
Yes.
think indicates quite a lot about mentality and just lack of care
Mm.
for the individual involved, whether it was intentional or otherwise. So, I think even if it wasn't intentional, it's still very much an aggressive act of murder at the
Yes.
end of it.
And in terms of the GHB, I mean, do you think he was wanting a sexual partner to be effectively non-responsive, a la Jeffrey Dahmer almost? Or was that just a byproduct of him wanting to use GHB and the partner
I
kind of ending
think
up that way?
I think GHB is one of those substances. I mean, I think it's highly likely that he'd perhaps used GHB prior to this,
Yes.
and was perhaps trying to escalate it further.
Mm,
Because often what you see when you're looking at offenders who are sexually motivated
mm,
is that there can be this escalation effect in their offenses,
mm,
where the things that are sexually gratifying to them at the beginning, they're looking for more and more extreme variants of that.
mm.
That's why you also start to see a lot of repeat modus operandi, because they're still
Yeah.
trying to achieve the same level of sexual gratification, but perhaps
Yes.
it's escalating. And I think it's entirely possible that that's what was happening with Port, especially when the police reviewed his internet search history
Yes.
and the pornographic materials he'd been
Mm,
consuming. A lot of that was around, consensual, non-consensual um,
yeah.
imagery and, sexual assaults and violence and unresponsive partners. So this is clearly someone who was interested in that, and perhaps I think these crimes were him trying to
Mm,
achieve that gratification that perhaps lower doses or just engaging with pornographic material was no longer fulfilling.
mm.
Um, which, yeah, unfortunately, like I say, is often, I think, a risk when you are looking at these repeat sexual offenders whose primary motivation is
Yes.
to fulfill that sexual gratification.
Yeah. And I mean, a great many serial killers geographically tend to stick close to home. But in his case, he did rather shit on his own doorstep, did he not? In terms of being that close to home. I mean, is there any reason why you think he's stuck with that? Was it a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Or was he just being incredibly brazen and assume he wouldn't get caught?
I actually think it's a combination of both. I think it was a convenience thing because,
Hmm.
again, remember, this is someone whose goal is sexual gratification. And so it's likely then that his victims are going to have to be in his home setting or in a
Yes.
setting with a bed, you know what I mean,
Yes.
to
Yeah.
enable that being his primary goal of the attacks. But I also think after what happened with Anthony,
Yes.
he perhaps realized that the police did not look further into this and he exploited the blind spots in policing because the issue that we had with because there was the four victims you had Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel and Jack, right?
Yes.
And I think the fact that they were young gay men who had engaged there was evidence in their blood work of them engaging with a substance
Yes.
that was known for use within chemsex.
Yeah.
Um, and on top of that, you have at least one or two of them who had engaged with consensual sex work.
Mm.
And I think essentially that meant that I don't want to go into a whole rant about, issues within, well, no, I probably will go into a whole rant about issues within the police force.
Yeah.
But I think basically those issues that we're all very aware of meant
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of these cases were not looked into in the
Yes.
detail that they should have been.
Yes.
And that means I think Paul essentially became aware of that after the first murder.
Yes.
And so he didn't actually feel the need to even bother trying to cover it up in great detail because
Yes.
questions weren't being asked enough.
But I mean, do you think he almost took that a step further when he wrote that fake suicide letter and he actually said, "Don't blame the guy I was with last night"? Do you not think
I
that
mean,
that was a little bit
yeah,
too obvious?
well, you'd think, right? But it
Yeah.
still wasn't at that point that the police picked it up.
Yeah.
So, absolutely, you'd think. So, he left that suicide note with Daniel.
Yeah.
And I think what's so shocking about that suicide note is that it's so slapdash, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was, and it was all the details around it just don't make any sense when you look at it. The fact that it had been put in a plastic Ziploc bag to stop it getting damaged by the rain,
Yeah.
even that should have been, an element of concern because who would be thinking
Yes.
about that if they were in such a place of mental
Yes.
distraught that they're
Yes.
considering taking their own lives? Why would they ensure putting it in a plastic bag? It doesn't really add up. And then, yeah, exactly as you said, in the note it says, don't blame the guy from last night,
Yes.
and doesn't have any other reference to any
No, that's
friends or
right.
family of Daniel.
No.
And that's so uncommon. That's,
Yeah,
within a suicide note contents, it would seem so bizarre that
exactly.
there
This is
would be
what I
no
thought.
reference,
Yeah.
yeah, to any other family or friend, within their life, and only referencing the guy from last night and Gabriel, because court was trying to frame that Daniel was responsible for Gabriel's passing.
Yes.
Um, yeah, it's really bizarre, and yeah, very slapdash, very chaotic. I don't know if this is a case of him just trying to wrap things up and
Mm.
not being very intelligent in doing so, or the fact he was getting so brazen and so, cocky, essentially, that
Mm.
he thought, oh, I can wrap up two in one and I'll just fix this, and they're not even going to look into it any further.
Yeah.
And you know what? I I wish he wasn't right, but he was, wasn't he? Because he went
Well,
on to
he
do it again.
was.
It wasn't caught.
Well, because I was going to say, with the half-hearted attempt at looking at them and not even linking them, despite the the same disposal ground, if you like. How
Well, yeah, the
important?
last three victims were
Yeah.
all in the same
Yes.
churchyard cemetery, right?
Yeah.
It was in a
I mean,
graveyard
I think
up
it was
against the
two.
same wall.
I think it was in two of the cases. It was the same dog walker who found the bodies.
It was.
It just seems rather stupid to me. But how important do you think Jack Taylor's family were in terms of actually getting it investigated properly, I guess?
They were instrumental, and my absolute respect to them for
Mm,
doing everything they did. And I'm just always devastated that they had to do what they did,
mm,
because they were the ones who refused to accept the answer that
mm,
they were being given, and went and sought out further CCTV evidence and all of
mm,
this. And thankfully, I believe it was, they ended up getting the police to publish the last CCTV image,
that's
trying to
right.
identify who the
Yeah,
person with Jack was. And thankfully, just a local police officer who had dealt
yeah,
with Stephen Port over the
yes,
Anthony case recognized him.
yes.
And it's only because of that that these things came together, but it shouldn't have had to get to that point
No, of
in the
course
first
not.
place.
Of course not.
Um, with such similar methods,
Exactly.
locations, victim profiles, all of these things should have been raising alarm bells, but
Yeah.
did not.
But why do you think it wasn't the case then? And do you think things are better now than they were?
Great question. So, like in criminology, there's this. It's not very nice, the terminology, but it's a kind of a theory, I suppose, or a perspective that's referred to as the ideal victim,
Mm,
and it essentially talks about how certain types of victim are given more victim legitimacy
yeah.
by the media, the police, the general public.
Mm-hmm.
And it's essentially groups of people who are seen as having less potential blame.
Mm-hmm.
placed on them. And this isn't a conscious thing that people go
No.
through. This is a subconscious process. But therefore, what you generally see, whether it's in cases of people being murdered or in cases of missing people, for
Mm.
instance, the ideal victim profile from this perspective is essentially, oftentimes, white, middle class women who are deemed quote unquote attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Various other factors involved, but essentially, the argument of this theory, this perspective, is that people who match these profiles are going to be more likely to garner sympathy from the general public, greater attention, greater pressure on police, etc., because they are
Mm.
more readily given the victim status.
Mm.
Um, I think what happens in this case is essentially the other side of that,
Yeah.
because as I mentioned before, you have young men who are gay, who have consumed a substance commonly associated with chemsex.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, at least one or two of them had engaged with sex work. And so I think basically what that meant is that the questions weren't asked.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm pretty sure Jack Taylor's family actually said this. They said if that was a young woman that had been found,
Yes.
this would have been looked into further. And
Yeah.
I agree. I think this is very much a case of there being not enough critical thinking. And there are various
Yeah.
arguments about why that lack of critical thinking might happen. It can be untrained police forces, it can be lack of resources,
Mm.
lack of communication within police forces,
Yes.
lack of funding leading to all of these different things. That the result is that we have, often people not doing that critical thinking when they are presented with this information, which in
Yes.
retrospect, when we're looking at this case, we can see clear evidence of questions that should have been asked, but for many, many
Yeah.
reasons they weren't.
I mean, it's always been considered the high risk lifestyles in terms of addicts, homeless, sex workers. But do you think that by us putting the label of high risk on it, we're actually labeling it ourselves in a way?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it's difficult. I think the reality is serial murderers know that.
Yes.
That's why so often serial murderers
Yeah.
target what we would call high risk
High risk. Yeah.
populations because they know that that is the easiest way to potentially get away with offences for a
Yeah.
long period of time, and they want to get away with it.
Yeah.
Which is why you so often see sex workers targeted, or people of color targeted, or in this case with Port, young gay men targeted. And
Yes.
I think it's a combination of the high risk terminology itself can be dangerous. However, what's more dangerous is not being aware of
Yeah.
those things as a general public, as society,
Yes.
because we then need to be aware to be able to protect those who need greater protection. As long as
Mm.
that means that because we're aware, we're now putting in active effort to protect them further.
Yes.
Not just being aware for the sake of it, but actually doing something to help. I mean, earlier you asked, is it better now? I don't think it is.
No.
I don't think it is. I mean, this was only 2014.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Certainly, in my mind, that wasn't that long ago.
No.
This isn't a historic case, and I don't think there have been enough progressions in law enforcement, in social awareness
Yeah.
that would mean that this wouldn't happen again. I think, things like technology advancements always have a role to play in reducing
Mm.
potential risks, but I think we still as a society have a long way to go in terms of being able to protect those within our
Mm.
society who are most at risk.
I mean, not that any of us have got a magic wand, but what do you think needs to change in order to get things going in the right direction, should we say?
I think On a very basic level,
Mm.
it's conversation, it's
Yeah.
awareness. I think that's the first step always in
Mm.
creating change. Um, because if we're saying, so going back to what I was saying about the ideal victims and how they're often the victims who might generate, for instance, the most press, the most traction, the most
Yeah.
outcry, and therefore pressure on the police and the justice system, I think it is then within our collective power as members of our society to ensure that victims, regardless of their backgrounds,
Yes.
are leading to that same presence and that same pressure on
Yeah.
law enforcement, because then that theoretically would mean further critical thinking and greater
Mm.
uh, investigations in these cases. And it might be that, I'm sure that the police, the Metropolitan Police or otherwise, are going to have come across cases similar to these where they found young men who have overdosed on a
Yes.
substance like GHB. And it's
Yes.
not anything more nefarious than
Yes.
what it might look like.
Yes.
But what we need to ensure as society is that we are putting the pressure there so that at least the
Yes.
questions are being asked. Because what happened here is that the questions weren't asked. Had
Yes.
they been, Port could have been stopped much earlier, and the number of victims could have been lower.
And
Frankly,
who is it, do you think, that is putting this apparent value on a person as a victim? I mean, is it the media? Is it the police? Is it all of the above? You know, who's attributing this value or lack thereof to a person?
honestly, I think it's all of us.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's us. I think it's society. I think it's the general public because the media are first and foremost there for profit,
Yes.
and they will print the headlines that will get people to pick up the papers. And if more people pick up papers when there's a certain victim profile who's on the front,
Mm.
they will print more of those stories. Similarly, the police obviously always have an expectation, a requirement to investigate all unexpected deaths effectively,
Yes.
and you know supposed to apply this professional curiosity. Like that's
Mm.
part of the College of Policing handbook guide to
Mm.
policing. However, I think we've seen it in many cases, even in recent years, where that social pressure can have an impact, and that can be positive or negative.
Yeah.
If we look at the case, for instance, of Sarah Everard and
Yes.
her disappearance, the pressure that put for that to be solved very quickly led
Mm.
to, I think, some, obviously there was investigation anyway, but I think heightened the urgency even further
Yes.
of that investigation. However, you can look at it the other way and see cases whereby the pressure leads to very fumbled policing.
Yes.
I forget their names, but there was the case in I think the 90s of the was it on Wimbledon Common, the murders that
Yes.
happened, and
Yes.
the sort of failed honeypot
Oh,
investigation
oh
that
God,
followed
yes.
that.
Yes.
And I think that's a case where you've got great social pressure to solve it,
Mm.
and that can lead to negative outcomes because of that pressure not being applied into, still logical and effective policing. Because we don't want rush for the sake of rush.
No.
We want urgency, but not
Urgency, yeah.
right. Um, so yeah, but I think ultimately it's a combination of all the above. But the only thing that we can all collectively do is
Yes.
amplify those voices that need amplifying.
Yeah.
I suppose kind of linked to this and linked to your question about whether this is any better. I mean, we had the Casey report, what was
Yeah.
that, 2 years ago now, looking at
Mm.
the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah.
And the Casey report identified both institutional racism and
Yes.
institutional homophobia
Yes.
within the Metropolitan Police, um, still to this day. So, I mean, I think that goes to highlight that things have not progressed in the way that they should have. The
Yeah.
lessons have not been learned in the way that they should have since this case, since
Yes.
many other cases. Um, and I think the problem is, though, as the Casey report said, these issues are institutional. None of this is to say that any
Yes.
individual police officer is
Yes.
actively racist or homophobic.
No,
I'm sure there are those who are,
of
but
course.
it's not to say that that is the fundamental issue. Well, no, it is a
Yeah.
fundamental issue. You know what I'm saying? Um, it's instead highlighting that the policies and the structures in place
Yes.
within the force are, within their very nature, not accepting or conducive to people of color and
Yes.
to uh, those of non-heterosexual sexualities.
Yes.
And I think this is then it becomes the bigger picture of, okay, how do you reform law enforcement, right? We
Yes.
need law enforcement for
Of
those
course.
emergency situations, but
Yes.
clearly there has to be some significant reform.
Yes.
For the Casey report to identify this in, the last couple of years, when and still identifying stuff that the McPherson
Yeah.
report identified in the late 90s after the investigation into Stephen Lawrence
Yes.
done by the Met and so bungled because of institutional
Yes.
racism. And so I just think there needs to be a combined effort of social awareness, us
Yes.
pushing for amplifying voices and encouraging change, but also there needs to be looking within law enforcement agencies to ensure that those institutional issues are addressed at their very root cause.
Yeah.
And honestly, that is a big job, and that is going to
Of
require, I
course.
personally think, a real reformulation of what our
Yeah.
law enforcement system looks like.
I mean, I know in theory, we're always told that we hold them to a higher standard when they're in law enforcement, but that they should be held to higher standards, but equally, they're just
But
people.
I think we do that with, they are just people, and I think we hold people to a higher standard with anyone who holds a profession
Yes.
that has power. If that's a
Yes.
teacher, if that is a religious leader, if that
Yes.
is a police officer, whoever it may be, if they are in a position of power, then they
Yes.
are held to the standard that that power demands.
Yes.
It's not about expecting them to be non-human, but
Yes.
it's expecting them to be exactly what their level of power over other people therefore expects them to be, because they do have heightened power. Like I said, it's
Yes.
not just law enforcement.
Yes.
Same with teachers. You expect teachers to be of a certain, way of mannerisms because they have
Mm.
power over the children that they are safeguarding. And I think it's just exactly the same for the police. So, I think the problem is you do have, individuals within the police force and institutional
Yes.
issues within the police force that exploit that power.
Yes.
And that's where a lot of these issues stem from.
I mean, do you think it's that they don't have a respect or an understanding or a knowledge of the power that they do hold?
I think to an extent, there's maybe a lack of understanding about the power dynamics at play. I think
Yeah.
you have individuals, if we go back to the Port case, I think
Yeah.
perhaps, again, going back to things like under resourcing
Yeah.
means that things like confirmation bias are led
Yeah.
into,
Yeah.
whereby they are seeing or they are looking for the evidence that supports
Yes.
their initial assumption, because perhaps they don't have the capacity or the knowledge to
Yeah.
be able to explore further.
Yes.
But yeah, I think in terms of power dynamics with the police and the public, there is a uh, not from all of them. Again, I'm never trying to group any collective of individuals to say that they are all the same.
Mm.
But I think just as an institution, there is maybe a lack of understanding that if you are being held to a higher regard, that we're expecting that higher regard from you,
Yeah.
then that is because of the power that we are, as a society, we are offering you that
Granting you.
power.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Steve. It's been good to talk through with you. And I mean, I just think the Port case is one of those ones that is it's fascinating and it's horrifying in equal measure because it is scary, I think, how seemingly clueless and unaware this perpetrator was, and yet how he was able to get away with it for as long as he did.
Mm.
Um, I think, unfortunately, failures, whether that be in wherever those blames might be placed, those failures definitely led to further murders happening. And ultimately led to four young men, Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel, and Jack, all losing their lives.
Mm.
And my utmost respect to all of their families and to Jack Taylor's family
Yes.
who were able to, have the strength and the perseverance to
Yeah.
push this to ensure that Port could not continue, because I
Yeah.
truly believe that he would have done.
And that was my incredibly informative chat with Honor Doro Townshend. And it was so good to get the views of such a notable figure in the crime and true crime worlds. Honor is a ridiculously prolific speaker on all things crime. And she has appeared and continues to appear in documentaries, including ones for Prime Video. This is not a sponsorship. The best way to stay up to date with where and when you might be able to catch Honor next, you should follow her socials, where she can usually be found at Honor Doro Townshend, or on her official website, honordorotownshend.co.uk, and both of those I will put up on the screen, and these will also be in the video description, because I'm the gift that keeps giving. Huge thanks to Honor for coming on Murder of Crows, and her views give us an insight into the criminal workings of a clearly very twisted mind. As ever, I try to be victim focused, so as usual, this episode is dedicated to the victims, who in this case were Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Kovari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. Please like, share and subscribe if you haven't yet. But with that said, I'm Steve. This orange mercenary right here is Samson. And we will see you when we see you.